Another important event of the civil rights movement was in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, just about a year later. These protests and boycotts and sit-ins had been picking up around all of the South. And Birmingham, Alabama was one of the last strongholds where these protests really weren't being very successful yet. A lot of that was due to a police chief named Eugene Connor. He gave himself the nickname Bull, which is always a bit suspicious, but he was determined. He was committed to promoting and protecting segregation in his city. He said it would be desegregated over his dead body. And so there was very little progress being made in desegregation in Birmingham, Alabama. And so the activists there, they called Martin Luther King Jr. and they asked him to come and help them with some tactics and strategy to try to be more effective in their protests. And the strategy that they come up with is that they will have children participate in a legal protest on the streets, carrying signs, advocating for desegregation. It's legal, it's peaceful, but just like their other legal and peaceful protests, they expect to be attacked by Chief Eugene Connor's forces. They're hoping that the children will deter that. And they know that if the children being there don't deter them from being attacked, then it will get picked up by the media. And the fact that these white men in Birmingham, Alabama attacked children will cause a lot of media outrage, and that will be good for their cause as well. And so either way, they feel like they'll win. Either they'll get to have their protest without being attacked, or they'll get a lot of coverage. This is maybe somewhat controversial because it's the idea of using children, risking children's safety, but the people who were participating in this activism, they were all in. This was worth their lives. It was worth everything to them. And the children who participated did so with their parents' blessing, and they were committed to the cause as well. The police force and the fire department in Birmingham did attack the protesters, just like they always did, using nightsticks, high-pressure hoses, and attack dogs to beat back the protesters. You can see in this picture that's behind this slide, this fireman is using a high-pressure hose, and that is extremely painful. Those are hoses designed to put out fires that are high above the street level, up at the tallest floors of a building, and so they have a lot of pressure behind them, and it's very abrasive to the skin. It's painful. It can knock somebody over onto the street. Here in this picture, you can see it's keeping these children pinned up against the wall. So it was very painful, and the question at the end is, was this all worth it? And the answer that the activists gave to that was yes, because they did spark a lot of outrage from the media and from other supporters, and as a result of the ensuing pressure, even Chief Eugene Bull Connor is forced to start making changes in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, what all of these protests are really working toward is a Civil Rights Act, a piece of legislation that will pass outlawing segregation and discrimination based on race across the board under every circumstance. And this Civil Rights Act is already on the books to be voted on under JFK, who is assassinated in 1963. And JFK himself was not particularly committed to this. He was much more invested in foreign policy than he was in domestic affairs. But this act is supposed to be before Congress during his term. Well, JFK's vice president is Lyndon B. Johnson, who is very opposite from JFK. He's not really all that well versed in foreign affairs, but he's very concerned with domestic issues, and one of those domestic issues is racial inequality. And so when he becomes president in 1963, he goes around to these various congressmen and he says to them, the way that you need to honor your fallen president is by voting for the Civil Rights Act that he wanted passed. And he uses JFK's memory and the loyalty, the patriotism that people feel about him to get the Civil Rights Act passed. And this is successful, and it passes in 1964, outlawing discrimination based on race in employment, in hospitals, in schools, and even in private accommodations. So people who owned their own business, and they weren't public services, they owned their own business, they could not refuse to serve people based upon race. And so this is what civil rights activists have been working for basically the last 10 years. This is the pinnacle. Now, the Civil Rights Act didn't specifically say anything about voting rights, and so the next year, after some additional activism, the government will also pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which reiterates that there has to be a right to vote for Black Americans, and it goes with the 24th Amendment, which again guarantees that right. Now, this is a very significant moment for the civil rights movement because it's what they've been working toward, and they've achieved that. It doesn't fix the problem clearly because there's still going to be racial bias, there's still going to be prejudice and discrimination and violence and all of these things. Legislation does not magically fix problems, but it's what they've been working towards, and they have succeeded in that. And now the civil rights movement has to decide where they're going to go from here and what the next stage is in the fight for equality. And this is where the civil rights movement begins to change, it begins to adapt, and people have different answers to the question of what comes now. Part of the reason for that is that there is a huge backlash against the 1964 civil rights movement. White resistance is growing. One of the ways that we can see that is through the program called COINTELPRO, which is a covert intelligence program where they will send white supremacists into activist organizations posing as activists, and they will gather intel on the people there to be used against them. They'll gather names, addresses, workplaces, upcoming sites of protests, and they will feed that information to white supremacist groups who will then attack these people or events. And so in the wake of the 1964 civil rights movement, we see some factionalism beginning to grow within the civil rights groups. It breaks off into two main factions. One that sticks with Martin Luther King Jr. and his pattern of nonviolent civil disobedience, which is the protests, the sit-ins, the speeches. He's going to be associated more with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He's going to have that connection to the Bible, to Christianity, that makes him very attractive to a lot of people. And their goal is integration. That's his famous speech, "I have a dream." And that dream is that one day Black and white people will live together, Black and white children will play together, eat together, learn together, and it will just be normal. So he wants integration. So that's one faction of the civil rights movement. But another faction breaks off under the leadership of a man named Malcolm X, pictured right here. And he's a very different figure from Martin Luther King Jr. He's about Black nationalism, meaning he wants to focus on what is best for the Black population specifically. He wants self-determination, or the right to govern for the Black population. He wants armed self-defense, meaning he's not advocating for outright violence on the part of the Black population, but he disagrees completely with Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea that if you are attacked during an activist protest or any time, that your best option is to not fight back and remain what Martin Luther King Jr. would say is remain dignified, remain outside of reproach. Malcolm X would say, absolutely not. If you're attacked, you fight back, and you fight back with a weapon, and you show the population that you are not going to be walked all over. He's connected more with the Nation of Islam, which is going to work against him ultimately. He became part of the Nation of Islam when he was in prison, and sticks with them for quite some time. It's a much more radical version of the Islamic religion or culture. It's separate from them. It's the fundamentalist or more extreme version, and he will try to distance himself from them, but that will not work out well for him. His goal ultimately is to have a Black nation. Again, he's not about integration. He wants the Black population to think about what's best for them, to be united as a specific group, separate from anybody else. In many ways, you could say that he's still for segregation, but just having a Black and a white population that live separately, govern separately, and do everything separately, so that that's the only way that the Black population can really be equal, is if they govern themselves separately from the white population. Malcolm X will form the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and one of his most famous speeches, like Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, Malcolm X's version of that is, quote, the ballot or the bullet, which is basically make sure that we have the right to vote or face the consequences of that. One of his more well-known statements is, nobody can give you freedom, nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you're a man, you take it. So he's much more active, much more direct, much more aggressive in the way that he conducts his activism. He doesn't have very long to be influential in the civil rights movement, though, because he is assassinated in February of 1965, most likely by the Nation of Islam, who he had, again, tried to distance himself from. The Nation of Islam doesn't handle distancing very well. That's not one of their favorite things to deal with, and so they have him killed. And so he himself isn't a activist figure for very long in person, but he is credited with beginning the Black Power movement, which is this movement that advocates self-consciousness, self-determination, pride in Black heritage, armed self-defense, and all of these different concepts. He will be considered the father of that movement. And the Black Power movement will really take over the civil rights movement from the late 1960s on. Martin Luther King Jr. will be assassinated in 1968, and when he is assassinated, that really radicalizes the civil rights movement, because he was the leader, he was this beacon of peaceful protest, and now he's been killed. That will cause a lot of activists who followed him to move into this more radical version of Black Power, and so that will take over in the late 1960s. Black Power encompasses a lot of different ideas, one of which is Black is beautiful. It's this celebration of Black heritage, the way that Black women look, natural hair, the Black man in his uniqueness. It's celebrating the uniqueness of being part of the Black culture in looks, in heritage, in culture, in dance, in music, in everything, because that anything that's specific to Black culture has been oppressed and degraded and considered to be lesser than for many, many years. And so it's a celebration of everything that can be associated with Black culture. You can see here in this picture is one example of the natural hair movement, where women and men alike begin to grow out their hair into afros that become sort of symbolic of the 60s and 70s. The Black Power movement also creates the abandonment of the word Negro. Prior to the Black Power movement, Negro was used relatively universally by Black and white people to refer to a Black person. But it's a word that is associated with many years of oppression and discrimination. And so the Black population in the United States abandons this word Negro. It becomes something that is politically incorrect and offensive to say, even though it has been part of, for instance, the New Negro movement of the 1920s. That would not have been considered an offensive title at that time, but after the late 1960s, it would be. And so this is where we begin to see the adoption first of the term colored, that somebody is colored, and then that becomes abandoned as well, and we get African American, and then just a Black person. So they go through these different stages of the Black population in determining how it wants to be referred to, or how the individuals want to be referred to, and as opposed to having the white population impose these names on them. The Black Panther Party, which formed in 1966, is one of the largest proponents of the Black Power movement. And you can see them pictured here. They look very aggressive, almost militaristic. They're going to promote the idea of armed self-defense, and they're based predominantly in California. They would walk through California neighborhoods with huge rifles over their shoulders, not threatening anybody with those rifles, but making it known that they had the power to fight back if they needed to, and making that point very strongly. A lot of people were very afraid of the Black Panther members, what they might be willing to do for their cause. In general, it was not a violent organization, but it certainly had the potential to be. One of the things that the Black Panthers advocated for was the release of Black prisoners. Already in the 1960s, we're recognizing that there is a disproportionate number of Black people in prisons based on population numbers. And so if you have a percentage of the population that is Black, theoretically that same percentage in the prison should be Black. It should match better, but there was a very high number of Black prisoners as opposed to white prisoners. And so people are already beginning to identify that as a new form of segregation, that because slavery had been outlawed, because segregation had been outlawed, the next thing, the next wave was going to be to confine Black men in particular to prison as a way to keep them out of the general population. And so they advocate for the release of Black prisoners, which also contributes to this idea of them being aggressive, radical people. But in reality, a lot of the programs that the Black Panthers had were programs to help aid poor Black Americans. They had breakfast programs that provided food for school children before they had to be in class. For instance, they did a lot of things in their community to help uplift Black Americans in general. The rise of Black power does have a radical element to it, and it will mirror the radical element of all of the individualism movements that we'll talk about when we get into the 1960s. Around the year 1968, almost every single movement radicalizes, and Black power is no different. But that's getting into the 1960s, which is where we'll begin next week for Module 4.